Well, my topic tonight is the role of religious voices in this public debate. And I want to take a look at kind of the classic formulation of so-called public reason that one of the great liberal theorists, John Rawls, put forward. I'm going to look at that, critique that, and then pose at the end of the talk what I think ought to be a virtue of civility that ought to govern and constrain our public contributions rather than an idea of public reason. That's a kind of overview of where I want to go with this. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. used a rich array of biblical imagery to promote civil rights, and I think anyone who's familiar with his speeches knows that Scripture was a profound and fundamental inspiration for him. It shaped and formed his social and moral imagination. Yet, if you look at the inscription wall at the new King Monument in Washington, D.C., which is meant to convey, I think, his rhetorical genius, one of the great public speakers of the 20th century, one finds that only one of the 14 quotations on the inscription wall features his characteristic biblical vocabulary. In that quotation, Dr. King paraphrases and applies the ringing words of the prophet Amos. We are determined. I can't do the voice, although I can hear it in my head. As I said, one of the great public speakers of the 20th century. We are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. But that's it. A visitor would otherwise never know that Dr. King was a fiery Baptist preacher rather than a political philosopher or a well-meaning, liberally minded moralist. Now, it seems to me that the suppression of Dr. King's religious side is, in fact, a sign of the times. In recent decades, a consensus has emerged that religious ideas and theological arguments are private and sectarian in character, and therefore they should not be offered in the public square. Religious themes can perhaps be used to good rhetorical effect. Obviously, we may be religious, as was Dr. King, and perhaps even passionately so. But this consensus tells us that we must appeal to what is called public reason when entering into public debates, which means forswearing appeals to religious doctrines, or even, in many cases, appeals to robust moral convictions. Now, as I said, the person I'm going to focus on, the great liberal theorist John Rawls, provided the most well-developed and influential case on behalf of public reason. What he calls comprehensive doctrines provide us with the sort of big picture answers to the question of the meaning of life. They include religious doctrines, of course, but also philosophical theories. Now, Rawls recognizes that we need these so-called comprehensive doctrines to make sense of our lives, but for the most part, he thinks that they're not fitting bases for deliberation about the common good. St. Paul and Aristotle, well, fine for private study, but an inspiration, but best kept out of the public square. Our public reason should be political, as he famously said, not metaphysical. Now, in a general way, the distinction between public reasons and the inner workings of theology and metaphysics makes a certain kind of sense. St. Augustine distinguished between the city of man and the city of God. By his way of thinking, the most we can hope for in the earthly city is a rough justice that keeps violence in abeyance, while in the city of God, love orders all things. Now, others have taken a more positive view of what can be accomplished in the city of man, but nearly all have affirmed the difference between secular politics and what I would call the divine politics of redemption. The duties of the Christian in the public square, however transformed and perfected by faith, are not the same as his calling as a member of the body of Christ. Yet, I want to argue this evening that this difference does not produce the strong distinction between so-called public reason and the supposedly sectarian character of religious arguments, a distinction that Rawls and many other commentators insist upon. As I hope to show, the notion of public reason is far more slippery than its proponents recognize, and the public potential of theological arguments is more expansive. Moreover, public reason often ends up a wax nose, indicating only the sorts of arguments that yield conclusions that secular liberals favor, and ruling out other approaches. This partisanship masquerading as neutrality contributes to a growing atmosphere of distrust that makes the sharp conflicts over culture in our times even more divisive. Therefore, as I plan to argue at the end, what a pluralistic democratic society needs is the virtue of civility rather than a theory of public reason. Okay, now to kind of a exposition of Rawls's idea of public reason. Now, democracy is a kind of a feel-good word for Americans. We're all pro-democracy. In our foreign policy, we often want to spread democracy around the world. However, it was as much feared as desired by the founders, who designed a republican form of government with the explicit goal of limiting and restraining the power of the people. Nonetheless, I think it's entirely fair to say that America has consistently encouraged a democratic culture. The New England Town Meeting, the Granger movement, and other forms of civic life play a large role in our democratic imaginations. And they do so because they represent an ideal civic encounter of equal citizens, each of whom is entitled to have his say. R.J. alluded to that in his observation about the Greek ideal of the meeting, which is the question, who has something to say? So democratic culture has a lot to do with this civic encounter of equal citizens. We're thrilled, the American imagination is sort of thrills at the thought of the weathered farmer whose rough speech but penetrating wisdom sways his fellow citizens at the town meeting, triumphing over the polished but corrupted town lawyer or bank president. This kind of thrills us, the idea. And we're thrilled not just because we're aware that official representatives of the common good cannot always be trusted, which is of course the case. We also have an intuitive appreciation of the dignity of the political life. Aristotle thought, at least he sometimes thought, that politics is the highest good because it involves a deeply consequential use of our reason. How we order our common life is the most important question we face, short of how we order our souls with respect to God. A genuinely democratic culture need not, therefore, have any particular democratic procedure. For example, it can have the indirect election of officials, as was the case with the United States Senate up until 1913. It can have rotten boroughs, as did the British Parliament into the 19th century. It can have many defects of democratic procedure. But it seems to me that democratic culture must have an atmosphere of open participation in its defining debates. As those who insisted on the First Amendment of the Constitution recognized, our freedom to stand on a soapbox matters a great deal, perhaps more than access to the ballot box. When we have our say, we're participating in the making of laws at a deeper and more engaging level than when we pull a lever in a voting booth. Not to say that's not unimportant, but I think we're participating in a substantive level. We're having our own say rather than simply choosing representatives who will speak for us. That's why our political scene is regularly agitated by eruptions of populism. Movements like the Tea Party excite those who sympathize because they feel as though they finally have a voice. Voice is sometimes more important than a vote. Now, we should not take our democratic culture for granted. From the perspective of human history, it's as rare as the rarest orchid. And John Rawls was aware of this fragility, and he formulated his notion of public reason in order to encourage active, informed participation in the political life of society. The more people who are in on the reasons for this or that public policy, the more fully and deeply we can collectively participate in the political process. And I call this the participatory principle of public reason, participatory principle. The electoral laws of a democracy should ensure, of course, that all citizens have access to the voting booth, but the informal rules of debate in a democratic culture also should ensure that all citizens have access to the substance of the reasons given for public policies. Therefore, when we get up on our soapboxes, he reasoned, we need to make arguments that the public at large can grasp. That seems to me a fundamental insight there. Now, it strikes me that the participatory principle is important and fundamental. However, Rawls adds a second and much more suspect principle of parsimony, one that rules out so-called comprehensive doctrines and makes religion unwelcome in the public square. So I want to say, what is the principle of parsimony? Now, at work here is more than a desire to promote peace by fending off intractable conflict and divisive controversy. Principle of parsimony is to sort of limit things to a kind of minimum that we can all agree on, whether it be science or common sense. Now, Rawls has in mind here, it's more than just eliminating divisive controversy. Rawls has in mind an ideal that is dear to modern liberalism. And it's the ideal of the perfect harmony of law with will, the frictionless coordination of the individual with the norms of community. Now, the opposite of this ideal is heteronomy. That's the ideal of autonomy. And the opposite of it is heteronomy. And it's the condition of having to obey laws that one does not agree with or assent to. For Kant, this constitutes a very dire moral affliction, having somebody else give us laws rather than autonomy at giving ourselves the laws. It's a kind of dire moral affliction. And here Rawls implicitly follows Kant in seeing heteronomy as a dire moral affliction. Now, of course, it's true that no actual society will achieve universal agreement about all of its laws, thus eliminating heteronomy. Obviously, if there are certain laws you think are wrong or unjust, it's heteronomous for you to have to obey them. It's not possible to make all the laws reflect everybody's views. But nonetheless, for Rawls, we should see universal agreement as an ideal toward which we should aim. And again, this is not for the sake of avoiding conflict, but instead we should aim at this ideal in order to realize our moral end, which is autonomy. And which means, in a political sense, it means the full free assent, our full free assent to all the laws and limitations that govern our lives. Saying yes to all the laws as being the very laws that I would choose if I were the one making them. It's not enough for me to it's not enough then for me to have my say. In the best of circumstances for Rawls, my vision of the common good will be exactly what everyone else's vision of the common good is. And thus it will govern as the democratic and general will of the polity as a whole. This is basically Rousseau's idea in the social contract of a perfect democratic society where the individual will and the general will are one and the same. There seems to be no end of religious disagreements as well as disagreements about other kinds of comprehensive doctrines. And so, universal agreement necessary for the full realization of at least political autonomy seems like a pipe dream. I think anybody reads The Social Contract by Rousseau, it seems like a completely unrealistic project. Now, however, it seems to me that Rawls saves this ideal of perfect unity of of my say and the collective judgment of community. Rawls saves this ideal by taking it in the direction of John Stuart Mill, which is the opposite of Rousseau's kind of complete unity all the way from the most fundamental questions to the most trivial ones of totalitarian vision in the social contract. In the Millian vision, the vision of John Stuart Mill that Rawls develops, were to limit public life to what we can agree on, leaving people to believe and do as they please when it comes to ordering their private lives. So we agree with respect to public reason, and we can order our private lives in accord with what he calls these big picture comprehensive doctrines, which would include obviously religious beliefs. And do so, of course, as long as they don't violate the basic minimum that we agree on. In other words, we can approximate the ideal of autonomy in public life if we make our arguments as non-controversial as possible. Here's how he puts it. Quote, "We are to appeal only to the presently accepted general beliefs and forms of reasoning found in common sense and the methods and conclusions of science when not controversial." This is the principle of parsimony. Cut out the controversial claims about religion and metaphysics. Stick to common sense and fact-based arguments that everyone or nearly everyone accepts. With this approach, Rawls envisions that the laws governing public life can approximate our individual personal convictions and judgments about the common good, and then achieve this kind of political autonomy in the political realm. All right, so the principle of participation, the principle of parsimony. Principle of parsimony, admittedly, kind of more complex to try to explain. The principle of participation, fairly straightforward. So how do religious arguments measure up to these two principles? Many, I'm going to argue, perhaps most, satisfy the first, that is to say, the principle of participation. And few satisfy the second, that's the principle of parsimony. But as I hope to show, the principle of parsimony is misguided. So in this section of the talk, I want to show that religious arguments are actually arguments that lots of unbelievers can engage in and participate in, whereas the principle of parsimony, keeping it down to the minimum, religious arguments clearly don't hold up very well to that principle, but it's a misguided principle. First then to participation. Now look, if judges depend upon seers and oracles, it's hard to see how we can participate in their decisions. Or for that matter, legislators. If they're reading bird entrails as a way of making laws, it's hard to see how I as a citizen can participate in that decision making. After all, the oracle says what it says, or at least it says what the judge says it says. And we just have to accept the outcome. Thus says the Lord. The same holds for closed meetings and classified memos, which is why they're such a threat to democratic culture. We can't be in on reasons that we're not told. Now, many commentators wrongly assume that religious arguments about public life are akin to reading bird entrails, or what liberal theorists often refer to as private reason, in a kind of, as opposed to this exalted public reason. Now, it is true, as Jesus says, that only those who have eyes to see can see, and ears to hear can hear. The fullness of the truth of Christ comes only through our self-abandoning embrace of Him in faith. However, even the mysteries of faith are, in an important sense, accessible to the unbeliever as real possibilities for belief. That's why the world is awash with apologetic literature, which I'm sure this library is full of. And people read it, and it makes a difference. They change their minds. So it can't be like reading bird entrails. Now, this is all the more true. It's not merely private if it can be made public in the form of apologetic literature. Now, this is all the more true when it comes to Christian teaching on moral and social issues that are relevant to legislating for the public square. For example, a sound Christian theology of marriage involves biblical, philosophical, and historical arguments, all of which can be engaged and weighed by non-Christians who take the time to study them. Moreover, as I've already indicated, when it comes to applying the theology of marriage to the formulation of laws, there's a long tradition of Christian reflection on the limits of politics and the proper distinction between theology and civic administration. Therefore, even if a Christian speaks in a distinctively theological way in the public square, there's a great deal for other people to discuss and debate. Present an atheist with an argument about marriage based on the story of the union of the first man and woman in Genesis 2, or one that appeals to Ephesians 5, and he's very likely to reject that, not to accept that argument just because it's biblical. But when St. Augustine and Luther discuss marriage and draw on those passages, their citations of Scripture are interwoven with philosophical, historical, and sociological analysis. Moreover, because biblical concepts and images play such a fundamental role in Western culture, the biblical idiom itself will resonate far beyond the circle of believers, as Dr. King's famous speeches demonstrate. Archie Bunker may not have agreed with Dr. King, but he was in on King's message, by way of perhaps of rejection. In other words, he could participate. Now, it seems crushingly obvious to me that what makes arguments public is their currency, not their pedigree. Most Americans are capable of grasping the moral import of St. Paul's understanding of marriage as a binding, exclusive covenant between a man and a woman. It's condescending to say that an atheist is unable to entertain it and cannot make up his mind whether it ought to or ought not to shape public policy. As anyone who's taught a seminar or led a discussion knows, the fact that a moral ideal is Christian, or for that matter Jewish or Muslim or Hindu, does not make it inaccessible to a diverse range of people. Indeed, in my experience, those who want to redefine marriage today have no difficulty whatsoever understanding St. Paul's view. They reject it not because it's sectarian and therefore beyond their ken, but because, by their way of thinking, it's the morally wrong view. Not only, then, are religious arguments widely accessible, in fact, by contrast, the sort of fact-based arguments that Rawls commends are actually difficult for most people to grasp. Like, I would submit that St. Paul's view well, I'll get to that. For years, I served on university committees that made policy decisions. I was consistently struck by how few well-educated people could understand arguments based on statistics. It's really very striking. Intellectuals may not like this, but it's simply false that fact-based arguments, especially not sophisticated ones, can encourage or even permit democratic participation. Consider the question of global warming, or the supposed need for another round of monetary easing. What about fracking? Does it threaten the environment? These and many other questions, nearly all of us are unqualified to answer. And for this reason, the approach Rawls takes tends to devolve responsibility away from citizens and toward experts. The result is the opposite of a democratic culture. For anyone outside the charmed circle of fellow specialists, the modern expert is as beyond question as the ancient oracle. And here I would give the example. Look, the public debate about marriage in our society today, I would submit that St. Paul's arguments about marriage are widely accessible to almost all American citizens, and they understand what's at stake. In contrast, a sociological argument about the consequences of same-sex marriage for, we had a recent sociological study about the children of same-sex partners raised by people who have been in same-sex relationships. It's a long study, and I would submit that it's very difficult for any ordinary citizen to judge the significance or implications of that study. Or what about whether or not it would lead to a weakening of the institution of marriage? It's a kind of empirical sociological question. Not only is it something that so only the experts can have an opinion on. My guess is you get 10 experts in the room, we'll get 10 different answers to that question. So I think Rawls actually has things reverse, that what seems like the most accessible rational approach in terms of using science is actually the least democratic approach. Now, by contrast to this, the way in which the modern expert winds up becoming a kind of latter-day oracle in Rawls's view, by contrast, someone like Reinhold Niebuhr demonstrated in his supple use of biblical sources and theological concepts that a religious person speaking religiously can provoke a great deal of thoughtful reflection about the common good. Therefore, if we want to affirm the participatory principle, and I think we should, rather than limiting public reason, as does Rawls, we're far better off allowing debates about comprehensive doctrines. After all, they're exactly the sort of claims about the meaning of life that most people are very capable of discussing and debating, and actually kind of eager to do so under many circumstances. Now, Rawls is blind, it seems to me, to the participatory potential of religious and other arguments because he is so deeply committed to the principle of parsimony, which certainly keeps religion out of the public square. Faith is nothing if not epistemically extravagant. It's about God. It's overbelief, not underbelief. But is the principle of parsimony a sound principle, I ask? Now, to my mind, no, it is not a sound principle. In fact, it's an untenable principle. Now, to begin, the principle of parsimony seems unrealistic. Rawls recognizes that he's outlining an ideal and not a practical program, but he admits that as an ideal, his view of public reason needs to be at least imaginably put in practice. It can't be just imagined, it has to be imaginably practicable. But it seems that comprehensive doctrines are forever finding their way into public life. For example, when deciding a case concerning abortion, the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court wrote, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life," the famous mystery passage. Now, this formulation amounts to a bald assertion of metaphysical prejudice, akin to a pious judge basing his jurisprudence on the explicit claim that at the heart of liberty is our perfect obedience to God's will. Moreover, Rawls himself, I can't imagine a more transparent assertion of a comprehensive doctrine than that famous passage from the decision, the Casey decision that reaffirmed Roe v. Wade. Moreover, Rawls himself imports comprehensive doctrines. As I argued earlier, the principle of parsimony itself reflects a Kantian vision of a democratic culture that promotes autonomy, when it's a vision which is by no means widely believed or held. Now, tu quoque, the you too, is a logical fallacy. And so I want to press a deeper claim against the principle of parsimony. And this deeper claim has to do with the nature of politics. Politics are integral to human flourishing, not just because we have to come together and order our common life in order to protect ourselves, it's kind of Hobbes's view, nor simply to secure natural rights, Locke's view, but also because there is something fundamentally humanizing about substantive consequential debate, which is what political debates can be when we allow comprehensive doctrines to enter into public life in a forthright and articulate way. Now, we should not underestimate the positive dimensions of political controversy. In other words, parsimony minimizes political controversy for the sake of this ideal of autonomy. We all assent to the laws that govern us. I'm saying we shouldn't underestimate the positive function of political controversy, which outweighs the moral goal of autonomy. To the extent that public life frames big questions in light of comprehensive doctrines, our initial and often superficial, unreflective reasons for taking an interest in public life, often having to do with our own self-interest, are challenged and expanded. It may be painful for a nation to endure debates about first things. There is no easy prospect for consensus. In fact, there's very little prospect for any kind of long-lasting consensus. As Pascal observed, the more existentially profound the subject matter, the more fragile our reasons and the weaker our arguments. And this is certainly the case in the political life. But such debates are enlivening precisely because the stakes are high. It's ennobling to live in a society that sees debates about the common good as serious business, so serious as to draw upon the fullness of our beliefs, including our religious beliefs. In short, controversy in itself is not a curse. In fact, it can, in a sense, be a blessing as it draws forth from us our deepest convictions. And therefore, we ought not to endorse Rawls's principle of parsimony. So I can make my case that religious arguments meet the principle of participation. It's conducive. It can function in a democratic society that encourages us to be in on the kinds of reasons that are given in public debate, and that the reasons for restricting it, the principle of parsimony, is a mistaken principle. So I want to conclude, though, by saying that, look, we can come back to Rawls in the Q&A. Rawls is not entirely mistaken. Something does need to be said about public debate. And that while it may be a mistake to have his pinched view of public reason, there needs to be some sort of ethic of public debate. After all, in a pluralistic society, debates about first things, comprehensive doctrines, as Rawls puts it, may be enlivening, but they're also dangerous. The wars of religion in Europe remind us of this danger, as do the more recent Protestant versus Catholic violence in Northern Ireland. The same can be said of conflicts between sects of Islam, or between Islam and Christian minorities under its domination, or between Islam and Christian majorities on its borders. The proponents of public reasoning are responding to real rather than imagined problems. Nonetheless, it seems to me that the way forward does not involve determining so-called supposed principles of public reason by which to regulate debate. This approach tempts the current establishment to define as non-controversial its own viewpoint while policing dissent, and thus impoverishing our public culture rather than protecting it. I think the loss of confidence in the mainstream media in the United States today stems in part from this tendency of the establishment to define its own beliefs as non-controversial and then to exclude dissent as somehow out of the mainstream. So it seems to me instead our goal should be debate, vigorous debate, fundamental debate, that is disciplined by the virtue of civility. And in the interest of promoting that goal, I'd like to end with a fittingly un-Rawlsian account of civility. That is to say, one that is based upon the Bible. Now, we can't go far, so I want to give a kind of a biblical account of civility that I think we ought to think about. Now, we can't go wrong, I think, if we begin with the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I don't like it when my views are distorted, nor do I enjoy it when others suggest that I have mean and selfish motives for my political views. And it seems to me the lesson that the golden rule provides is obvious for civility. Now, to the golden rule, I would add another basic moral principle, which is St. Paul's exhortation to us that in our enthusiasm, we should refrain from doing what is evil for the sake of some greater or higher good, Romans 3. Now, political debate is a contact sport, and rightly so. There's a great deal at stake. Therefore, it requires discipline to set aside the temptations to score rhetorical victories and sway minds with falsehoods or even half-truths. So, do not do evil, that good might come. Good principle to promote civility. Now, the golden rule and the principle that the end does not justify the means have an obvious relevance for public life, as I've said. Less immediate, but more pertinent for men and women of faith, is Jesus' assertion that his kingdom is not of this world. It's a helpful reminder to us that the passions of faith are appropriately warm and urgent. We cannot believe in Christ too much. Now, this is not, however, true of our political judgments. Christ's lordship makes a difference in this world, but it is not coextensive with it. It is not of it. Therefore, it seems to me the lesson for civility, our contributions to public debate should not be overloaded with feelings of final urgency, because our souls are not, in fact, at stake. In fact, I think this is one of the problems with the secular left, is that politics is, in the end, that their kingdom is of this world, and therefore their souls are at stake in politics. Now, this is not a reason, the fact that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, is not a reason to be nonpartisan. We cannot transcend politics from within, as it were. Civility disciplines substantive positions. It does not represent an imaginary higher position that manages or balances alternatives. Instead, we need to follow Jesus' advice. Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. It's no crime against civility to be wise as a serpent. That is to say, to mount vigorous, full-throated arguments for what you think is best for America. And to do so, in fact, while exploiting the weaknesses of your adversary's arguments. It's not evil to draw out and dramatize the weaknesses of your adversary's positions. Nor is it a violation of civility to make shrewd decisions about what to play up and what to play down in order to preserve effective political coalitions. We have a duty to speak the truth, but we don't have, well, we certainly have a duty not to speak falsehoods, but we don't have to always tell people always everything that's on our minds. So wise as a serpent in that regard. But we can't only be wise as serpents. We also need to be innocent as doves. That is to say, we need to cultivate a kind of political innocence, what I would call a holy indifference. If we always keep in mind that Christ does indeed already reign, it takes the sting out of political debates, and that's important. For the final argument for civility in public debate, I turn to the Epistle of James. The third chapter of the letter confronts the sins of the tongue, which are many, as we know. Indeed, among the Ten Commandments, it's the most emphasized, the sins of the tongues. One commandment from each table of the Ten Commandments addresses our speech. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. Do not bear false witness. The Bible is very concerned about our tongues. This double emphasis prefigures Jesus' teaching that we are to worry about what comes out of our mouths, what comes out rather than what we put in. I never really realized it until I was working on this paper that passage from Jesus when he confronts the Pharisees is related to the third chapter of the Epistle of James, which is related to the Ten Commandments' emphasis on the sins of the tongue, which is also related to Genesis 3. Some of the church fathers interpret the fall as ultimately Eve's mistake of talking to the serpent, sin of the tongue, telling the serpent things that the serpent should not know, like what it is that God hasn't commanded. Here, it seems to me this emphasis is very important. Now, it's in view of the dangers of an unbridled tongue that James urges discipline, drawing on a metaphor of the bit in the horse's mouth. Here, however, the goal is not simply to bridle excess. Yes, we invariably speak with anger, express calumny, we insinuate falsehoods. These are all things that we should repent of, because the passions of life do get the better of us, and including our civic and political passions, which is, I want to sort of write something in the near future about what I call political pornography, which is basically the 24/7 cycle of political reporting, which is designed to excite our political passions, just like pornography is it wants to excite our sexual passions. We're social animals. We have a social instinct, and it needs to be disciplined and constrained just as our sexual instinct needs to be disciplined and perfected. But James urges us to use the bit to seek to bring the tongue, to seek to discipline the tongue so that it brings in the harvest of righteousness. And he says in so many words, he who gains command over his tongue has attained perfection. Important message, and one that I think is at the center of a culture of civility. So in conclusion, we're in a season of intense political debate. Not just because it's an election year, but because the New Deal consensus that dominated American public life for so long is now under a great deal of stress and is in fact being openly questioned, much to the horror of many. At the same time, an increasingly confident cohort of secular Americans, many of them very powerful, has become tired of the residual limitations that Judeo-Christian morality places on personal decisions about gender, sex, marriage, reproduction, healthcare, and ultimately death. As we all feel in our bones, a great deal is at stake at present. We're having debates about these things and other issues, whether or not John Rawls wants them. And all of them implicate our comprehensive doctrines, including our religious beliefs. And it seems to me at this time of this crucial and fundamental debate, it's necessary for Christians to engage these questions in the public square. It's indispensable that we bring our voices into the public square. And we should do so in accord to our own best judgments about what constitutes an effective, persuasive argument, and not to let ourselves be limited by some sterile ideal of public reason. And it's equally important that in so doing, without blunting or softening our convictions, we should embody the virtue of civility. It's possible to have fundamental debates of deep metaphysical import and profound public consequence while still sustaining, it seems to me, the civic bond of friendship. Thank you.